Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you very much for being here again in this new edition of the webinars organized by the SHAIO. It's my pleasure today to present our speaker, Joao-Pedro Ferreira. Thank you, Joao, for your kind willingness to participate in this forum. Even more considering that you have to teach in 1 hour and an hour and a half, so thanks a lot. Okay, let me just briefly introduce our speaker. Joao-Pedro Ferreira is a postdoctoral research associate with the Economic Impact Analysis Program and adjunct lecturer in the Food and Research Economics Department. He holds a master's degree in local economics and a PhD in sustainable energy systems by the University of Coimbra, Portugal. His current research interests center in improving the traditional economic impact methods, both at the local and international level, and apply them in the analysis of shocks imposed by demographic change or other scale events. Joao is author of 18 publications in international journals, with publication in leading journals as Economic System Research, papers in regional science, tourist economics, renewable and sustainable energy reviews, among others. 5 book chapters and more than 50 other publications in conference proceedings and newspapers. Joao is also the chair of the scientific and local committees for the jornadas de análisis input-output that will be held in Aveiro in September, where we really hope to see you all in person. Today, Joao will present his recent research with the talk entitled Combining Econometric and Input-Output Methods to Assess the Regional Impact of Disasters, the Case of Heritage and Tourism in Florida. So thank you very much, Joao, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rosa. Thank you for your kind words. Thank you, SHAIO, for having me here and inviting me. I will start to share my screen. I hope you can see it well. Is it working? Oh, it's not on the first slide, but...
Yes, it's working.
It's working, okay. So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. So this work is the work that I'm going to present here is describing a little bit more the theoretical part of a set of papers that we have been developing that have been funded by GICUS, the Gulf of Mexico Coastal Ocean Observing System, but also from NOAA, the National Oceanographic Organization for the US. And they have been mostly developed with my colleagues Jinuan, Vigeta, and Krista Court, the coordinator of the Economic Impact Analysis program here in Florida, in the University of Florida. So basically, the idea is that, as most of you are probably aware, is that natural disasters, of course, they induce losses in society. Some estimations say that since 1980, the US has already observed almost 300 weather and climate disasters, and the estimated cost, the overall estimated cost of these disasters is almost $2,000 trillion. In this case, or what we are going to introduce here is the problem associated with harmful algae blooms. This is a particular event that occurs naturally, so it's commonly present in the nature. Now, what happens is that because of human activity, these type of events are becoming more and more common, and instead of happening offshore, they start happening in coastal areas or even in watersheds located in the mainland. These events can particularly affect tourism. We are going to particularly look to the 2018 red tide event in Florida. This is caused by a particular bacteria that is called Carinia brevis. Again, they usually begin offshore, but what happens is that when they arrive to the coast, they originate bad smell, they exponentially increase fish mortality. They have impacts on the shellfish toxicity, so all oyster production is affected, all the shrimp production is affected. But actually, they can also cause for humans respiratory or skin irritation. Inclusively, they can be, really harming when for people that have asthma or other respiratory complications. And then basically they end up leading to the temporary shutdown of some water-related activities for a certain period of time, depending on the extension and on how bad the red tide is. So these are some pictures collected by the University of Florida of what happened in 2018 here in Florida. Again, every year this happens, usually in small like in a very small scale areas and very localized areas. But the 2018 was by far, as some of our colleagues from science have determined, one of the worst red tide occurrence in the world since 2005. And so you can see here in the right that the areas affected were, and actually, if you see here in the Atlantic coast of Florida, in the right side, it was the first time ever that the red tide was detected on the side of the Atlantic coast, usually focused on the Gulf Coast. But the number of events in this year was clearly abnormal. It began in October 2017 and lasted until January 2019. So our goal here, the question that we had to answer, made by the policymakers, was, can you basically tell us what was the economic impacts of the 2018 red tide? And one of the ways that we thought that we could measure this, it was looking for the tourism activity, and particularly in this case, we will look at the Airbnb activity to estimate what are the economic impacts by this. For this, we will use some econometric techniques that then we will associate to a multi-regional input-output model in order to estimate what are the regional impacts and better assess, what we all know in input-output, but not only the direct impacts, but also the indirect and the induced impacts. So one of the first problems is that how to measure the red tides, right? How to say, well, there is an event over there is a problem located over there. How can we measure it in one way? So we had a data set with 125,000 records since 1954. But basically, what they do is that they include geographical coordinates. They include the number of the cell count of the bacteria per liter. And they also include other quality measurements that our colleagues from in the science side, like on the natural science side, are more concerned, like the temperature, the salinity, the levels of oxygen, so they can understand what are the conditions where these red tides happen. But one of the problems is that there is a kind of sampling effort. So the data is collected, but it's collected kind of randomly, except when they identify that there is a problem, they go to that place and they collect a lot of samples in the same day or in the following weeks to understand what happened there. But it's not a sample like the ones that we are usually work with that are pretty clean, or totally random, or that are done in a systematic way. No, we could have different tests being made in different months, and that's one of the problems that we had to deal with. But forgetting a little bit that point, when we look at the data, it's easy to see that another thing that was kind of difficult to tell is that, first of all, we actually don't know when do the social or the economic consequences of a red tide start, because some of the counties, they took measures when the level that they detect is low. Others took measures when the level is medium, and some things only happen when they detect more than 1 million cells per liter. So there is some heterogeneity here associated with the way that the counties behave when they detect the red tide. But in this work, we could clearly see that changes started to happen when tests started presenting a level above medium. That means 100,000 cells per liter, because at that point, it is pretty sure that the water is already reddish, that the activities of the near shore must be closed, that the shellfish, all the shellfish production is going to be lost on that area, because by law they have to throw everything away, and that starts having a probable effect in terms of respiratory irritation. But again, when we look at the data, we can see that even in places that are nearby, all these counties are adjacent counties on the southwest Gulf of area of Florida, that, for example, in Lee County, the maximum point, the red tide was worse in August, while, for example, in Sarasota, the numbers for more tests that indicated the presence of red tides are obtained in June. Charlotte is like as constant red tides along the months between June and November, but red tides was on and off in all these counties in Florida, but not in a steady and homogeneous way. So it's really sometimes it's small localized events that happen because there is a general red tide happening in the Gulf, but it's not at all homogeneous. So we thought that Airbnb could be a good way to look at this, because first, there is a flourishing Airbnb market in Florida. Like if you look at the 10 places in the world that have more Airbnb per square mile, 3 of them are going to be in Florida, not in this particular area, but in Orlando area. But again, it's still a flourishing market here in Florida. Tourism matters in Florida and is present everywhere, mostly in the coastal regions and in the Orlando region. And also Airbnb tends to react faster than, for example, hotels, accommodations, or other types of rentals. So we thought it could be a good way for us to try to measure the economic impacts through Airbnb. Just for you guys to understand, there are 126 million tourists from other US states that travel to Florida every year. 14 million tourists from overseas. The tourism spending in Florida is around 94 billion US dollars. The total economic impact that is associated with tourism, at least according to this website, to this organization, is $91.3 billion. It creates more than 1.5 million jobs. And between 2013 and 2018, the number of nights spent by tourists has been increasing a lot. So just for you guys to have a perspective, it's like the tourism spending in Florida accounts for as much as half of the Portuguese GDP, something like this. And this is the increase on the number of Airbnbs in Florida. Okay, so of course, if you can see here, the interior of Florida, mainly Orlando area, it's where 51.7% of the Airbnbs are located, but this area still represents 14.5 of the location of the Airbnb locations in Florida. So it's almost as if you want, it's actually, in terms of concentration of Airbnbs, is higher than the Miami area or the Southeast Atlantic coast. So it's still a very touristic area. Well, and the tourists they came, in terms of the Airbnb visitors profile, they came from everywhere. 25% came from Florida, 60% comes from the rest of the US, namely Georgia, New York, Texas, a little bit California, and 15.3% of the people that stayed in Airbnbs come from abroad. Here, mostly important markets: Canada, Brazil, United Kingdom, Germany. So a little bit from everywhere. So after looking at this pattern of the tourism, after seeing how much tourism is relevant, we basically used something that is called the AirDNA data that basically give us micro data on tourism and on Airbnb and allow us to identify what were the changes in price and in reservation days at the weekly at by week according to each Airbnb, and we have the coordinates for each Airbnb in Florida. It's a huge set of data because right now this data has more than 15 million Airbnbs registered. Not all of them are active right now. There are also some repetitions, so it was a bunch of work to organize this data, but at the end we end up working with information that was basically the monthly information on the number of tests that were positive in terms of the red tide, and also for all the coastal Florida counties, and also on the Airbnb side, we could have like all this information in terms of the economic variables of the Airbnb market. So we decided to test two ideas. So when there is a red tide, that was our main concern. Can we say that when there is a red tide, first, that there is an impact on price measured by the average daily rate? Or in the second assumption is that can we say there is a quantity effect measured by the number of reservation days? So basically, what we want to know is that are tourists paying less, and are tourists not coming because there is a red tide? Well, and to test these two types of models, first we identify that there were, and this is common in tourism studies, that there were specific characteristics of each county. So if we're using a panel data, there were kind of what you call fixed effects in terms of the counties. So we should add kind of dummy variables to explain the nature of the counties. And also, there were also effects associated with time. This is also normal in tourism studies because of seasonality. And so these are what we call a two-way effect in terms of fixed effects, because it means that we have a fixed effect both on the individual side and on the time side. And so using what is called the least square dummy variable estimators, we end up estimating and a set of control variables here. We didn't have a lot of information because we tried to have information that was consistent at the county level for all the counties in the coastal areas of Florida. And so, some counties, the information, we didn't have some kind of information. So we really debated here with the control variables. But at the end, we end up with a model that where the independent variables, so we were trying to explain both prices and the reservation days. We tried to understand that, taking into account if there was or there wasn't a red tide, or the number of tests that were that detected the red tide in that month in that specific county. And we ended up understanding that in average terms, for each test that detects that there is a red tide, Airbnb market was losing something like 45 cents in the average daily rate, and the decrease in demand would be approximately 345 reservation days at the county level for each month every time there was a red tide. So we know one thing, that tourists came and pay less. So there was an effect on price. There is a second effect that there were some tourists that did not come at what was the usual actual price. That's the effect on quantities. And this is the third mixed effect, that is the tourists that did not come and did not pay and would pay more, that combined both the price effect and the quantity effect. Through this, we estimate that in the counties that were affected by the red tide, the shock on the Airbnb market through price was something like $32 million, $31.4 million. The shock on the reservation days, and so tourists that didn't come, the shock was around $32.3 million. And this mixed effect shock that combines both the price and the quantity shock was something like $6 million. So at the end, this was the shock that we can identify on the side of the Airbnb market. Now, the Airbnb market only represents one part of the expenditure pattern of tourists in Florida. So we know that lodging and Airbnb usually represents 28% of what tourists spend on a daily basis. Now, of course, one may argue, and in the paper that we were preparing, we clearly say this. It would be better if we had a specific expenditure patterns for these tourists, but that information was not available. So we only had a kind of average expenditure pattern for all the Florida, which also accounts for, Orlando area or Miami area that having a totally different types of tourists. But this was the best information that we could use. But in average terms, what we know is that Airbnb represents 28% of the total expenditures by tourists. So in this sense, we kind of basically projected what was the other expenditures that tourists also have. Like they spend 23% in food and beverage services. They spend 20% in transportation. Here, we only account for local transportation. Airline tariffs are not here included. Shopping and retail, and also entertainment and recreation. Like, one may think that, for example, in these areas, more beach areas, tourists won't spend that much in entertainment and recreation. Actually, it's not true, because many tourists, like, they rent a boat, they go fishing in the sea, or they go to lakes and do some jet ski over there. So it's kind of also true that there is also some entertainment and recreation associated with this type of tourists. So we basically end up using this as the best thing that we had, knowing that this is one of the limitations of our study. So our goal was to achieve the local and regional economic impacts of red tides. And so in this sense, because, tourism was affected, sure, the Airbnb was affected, hotels were affected, restaurants were affected, but because of that, because there is clearly there was clearly less economic activity on these areas that were affected by red tides. Of course, these effects also happen in the value chain. So if restaurants are consuming less, agriculture producers will also be affected somehow, or grocery stores will also be affected somehow. And so we wanted to understand all these indirect effects. On the other hand, we want to include the induced effects because it was also a shock on the income of the households in this region, particularly the ones that live from accommodation. Accommodation workers in the US, they live a lot of tips, and they work almost on a daily basis, to have their wages on the daily basis. And so if tourists don't appear, their income is immediately affected. So we want to study all these kinds of effects. So we use a multi-regional input-output model based on InPlan. It has 546 industries and commodities. It distinguishes among 10 different types of households. And in this case, we try to estimate intra and inter-regional effects by using two regions in the model. The Southwest Gulf or Southwest Coastal region, that was the one more affected that included those counties that I specified before, and the rest of Florida, to understand what were the consequences in the Florida's economy. Now, why is this important? Because one of the things that happened here is that sometimes other counties in the Orlando area or in the Atlantic area, they are not so concerned with what's happening in the Gulf area because, at the end, it's almost like if tourists don't go there, probably they will go to the places, to other places, and they could benefit from this. But one of the things that they asked us is like how this affected the rest of the economy of Florida. And so we wanted to provide with those numbers. And so at the end, we can see that one of the things that we all know this in input output, but I think it's important that we say this to the rest of the society is that, the direct effects represent between 50 and 70% of the whole economic impact. So there is a lot of economic impact that happens through the value chain and the indirect effects. And there is also a lot of economic impact that ends up happening through the induced effect and the loss on income. So one of the first conclusions is that we can see that there are there are more economic impacts than the ones that are usually only estimated by the tourist studies that only look to the direct impacts. The other thing is that depending on the economic measurement that we can use, but the impacts in the rest of Florida are quite significant. So at the end, the total impacts that we estimated in terms of output of this shock in the Airbnb market was around $300 million in the whole Florida in terms of output, almost $200 million in terms of gross value added, almost 2,900 jobs that were lost. The shock on labor income was something like around $120 million. And also, in terms of what is the tax collected, the impacts were around $45 million. But as you can see, almost between 15 and almost 20% of the impact is felt on the rest of Florida. So despite the impact is very localized and affect the counties on the southwest coast area, it is like somehow relevant to say, look, if you are in Miami and you work, you have customers or you have clients that live in the southwest coast area, probably you were also impacted by this, as the whole economy of this region was somehow impacted. So again, it's indirect and induced effect can represent almost 50%, for example, in terms of output. And just one more side note, it's important to see that in employment or in tax collected, the direct impacts are higher. Why does this happen? Because tourism activities are more labor intensive and they are the ones that suffer the direct impacts. And also here in Florida, as we don't have state taxes for the people that work here, but tourists pay taxes, like these activities pay much more taxes than the overall economy. So that's why the direct impacts are higher. So there are several conclusions that we can highlight from these results, but at the end we can also see that something again that people input output know, but it was really interesting when we start explaining this to other partners outside is that it is true that the most affected sectors in terms of employment or in terms of GVA are the ones that suffer the direct impacts. For example, accommodations or this is the car rentals or the full service restaurants or even the amusement parks or whatever. It is also true that many of the other sectors that are then, where we can see important losses are the ones that only suffer from indirect and induced effects due to the effects on the supply chain on income. So basically, we, in terms of conclusion, we were able to conclude that for every time that Carina brevis is detected above medium, and so the water is reddish and people cannot go to the water in that area, the average price of the Airbnb will decline 0.5%, $0.45. The number of reservation days will also decline. This led to a total loss of $70 million in Airbnb market, which translated in a decline of $185 million spent by tourists across state, which at the end translates, as I just explained, in different shocks in the economy. Now, of course, we are dealing with real data here and a real world problem. Some of this data had to be adjusted. We could have better data. This only shows the shocks that we could measure through the Airbnb side. But for example, we are trying to replicate this study right now to include the accommodation sector. There were also people that have secondary houses in Florida that in that year they didn't come because they knew that there was a red tide, and even property values are also affected. We are doing this study in a different kind of, using different other methodologies. But of course, we will try. We think that this methodology, even if we try to use other econometric techniques, or even if we move from implant to other kind of models, we think that this way to combining econometric methodology with input-output can be really useful in studying the economic impacts of these local events that can affect the economy. And for those regions where tourism matters, that could be a good way to assess what were the impacts. Look, luckily, we have an amazing communication office here in Florida. It has been really interesting to understand on when we are capable of translating these things to a broader audience, and we keep it simple. At the end, there are important impacts on the media, and as a researchers, we end up actually contributing to better solutions and a better understanding of the social and economic impacts of this phenomenon. And before finishing, I would like to invite you all to come to Aveiro in September. We are trying to prepare a conference where everyone is going to feel well and everyone is going to have the opportunity to go back in person and discuss these topics and other topics. Just as a quick reminder, we have some important dates here, like the abstract submission is until May 15, the registration is until July 30, and then we will have for sure a very productive day on September 21 with the school, Spanish school on input-output, and also the conference September 22 and September 23. I would like to welcome you all. Ask me all the questions that you want of my work and of Aveiro, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. It was a pleasure to be here.
Okay, thank you very much, Joao, for your excellent presentation, and also for the presentation of the Aveiro meeting that we wanted after to ask you, so you have do everything. Okay, we have now some minutes for questions, for comments on the presentation. Or Jorge, do you have a question? Okay.
Yes, fast question because I have to leave the webinar in 2 minutes. So you have said that Florida has first, congratulations, you have impressive presentation, great work, and congratulations for that disclosure in the media. I think it's a very interesting work for sure. You have said that Florida has a big tourism industry. So for the projection of the changes in the tourist expenditures patterns with red tides, of course, do you have a Florida-specific tourism satellite account or not?
No, we don't. It's one of the things that we are thinking of working on that, but officially, the official data is not the best one. And we are working on preparing ourselves to here in the department in the economic impact analysis to produce a better data that we can use in future works. But right now, we don't have a tourism satellite account. We don't even have an official input-output model for Florida. We have one here in the department. So it's kind of tough on that side, but clearly something that we should think on the future.
Okay. So second question, you are working with a multi-regional input-output model. So Florida is a kind of disaggregated table from the big US table, or
yes,
or how are you dealing with this problem?
Yeah, so we are dealing with that problem in two different ways. Right now, we are thinking of establishing our own model here in University of UF that is more Florida specific. But what we are using now is many researchers use that in the US, is the in-plan model that is it's a derivation from the national table that uses a lot of data. In-plan has been doing this for 30 years. I think they do a good job, but yet is not that state specific or local specific as we would like. So right now in this work, we still use in-plan. I think in the future, the best way is to move to a local or more state-specific and local-specific model that better identifies the characteristics of the economy.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, George.
Okay, other questions?
Can I do a question?
Yolanda.
and you can turn on the camera because...
No, because since my name is webmaster, so maybe it's not clear who I am. So really nice presentation. I really like it. So my question goes more on the red tides and my unknown. So can you actually predict them, or they just arrive? They just arrive.
It's awful. Like here in Florida, they have a particular way of treating and predicting blue and green red tides, but blue and green tides, which is a different one. They are less problematic. They are not that dangerous. But the thing about red tides is that as the science is right now, you don't understand why they start. You understand that the conditions are there for it to happen, but you are not exactly sure if it's going to happen or not. And also, you cannot, how can you say this? There is no way of stopping red tides or minimizing their effects, because they happen to, they end up happening in the ocean, and they are like vast areas of water. Like there is nothing that you can do on the human side to reduce their impact in the society. So it's just, okay, it's the nature working. We know that it's because nutrients from human activity are going through to the water that increases the chances. We know that, for example, every time that if the conditions are already like somehow if you already have the conditions to happen, if a whale, for example, that has 20 tons dies, that will probably start a red tide that can grow or not. But nobody understands well why red tides happen. And so that is
so at the same time, you cannot predict how long it's going to last.
No.
Exactly. So it can be, short, like 2 days, or it can be like...
Yeah.
Now, because I was wondering, particular in the tourists that is coming from abroad, since you cannot predict, you are going to arrive to Florida, let's say.
Exactly.
So what can be happening, and this is what I'm wondering, if, for example, you see that 2 days with the red tide, and you come from Germany, let's say, to the sun, to pick some bits. So can be that they cancel and move to other county in Florida. So that this regional effect, there is winning people.
Yeah. So that's one of the things is that our Airbnb data was not that good in the non-coastal areas. Okay. And so we could not see if there was a positive effect, because there was a negative effect in the coastal areas, if there was a positive effect in the mainland. But that's, of course, an important issue that we should study.
Or in the coastal effects from the other side, can be.
From the other side, sure.
I mean, because if you are searching like sea.
Now, what my colleagues here that study social media and the perception of tourists, considering what comes up in the social media and on the news, because this come up on CNN, this come up in some of international news, and probably what they think is that overall, the tourism in Florida was affected, because if you know that this is happening in Florida, you won't come to Florida at all, right? So, and if you want to go to the Caribbean area, you probably will choose Dominican Republic or Mexico. So that we know that happened, that some tourist operators, for example, took people from here to Mexico, okay? Or took people from here to the Dominican Republic, but it's still not exactly clear. So these effects on tourism and trade-offs, we didn't study them on this work, but other people are trying to look at that. And if we have better data, we hope to look at that, definitely.
No, because also, since you said that you will be checking like traditional accommodations.
Yeah.
So maybe from there, I don't know how you are going to pick the data. You can distinguish between national and international. So I guess the nationals adapt faster to the red tides, international not. So you can have a measure more or less like if this effect is important at the very end or not. Like if the international is flexible or I mean, elastic also, or inelastic, let's say.
Also, the Airbnb data doesn't have that much data on clients. So we cannot know where clients are coming from and what were the ones canceling. What we know is that the comments that they make, and if they put there Yolanda from Santiago, Spain, then I can know that there was a comment made from Spain in that particular Airbnb. But I cannot know who canceled or not based on their so.
Yeah.
It's
because actually you just know who arrived, not who canceled.
Exactly. But at the end, like, this was the first number that was produced, and everyone is looking at it now.
And it's really nice, just ideas for. I mean, there is the whole field and the potential, analysis that you can do with this. Like if there is compensation effects, if they are moving, is who is losing, who is winning. I mean, there is the whole field, so a lot of work ahead.
Yeah, of course.
So really nice, actually.
Okay, more questions? No. Me, I have a question for you also. No, it's just about the induced effects. Not the indirect, but the induced effects, because are quite relevant in some sectors. And I was wondering about the assumptions about how the reduction in the income at the local level is translated to reduction in consumption. Do you assume a part of this income? Or
so we are using in-plan.
Do you endogenize all the
Yes. So
okay.
they endogenize the whole income and they translate that entirely in consumption. Okay. This is not how I do it. I would never do it like this, to be honest. But that's how they do it, and that's why they end up producing a multiplier that, for me, is a little bit friendly of increasing the shocks a little bit. Okay. But we didn't have any better. We still don't have our model here, so we couldn't use a more reasonable model. But I think it's better to produce some numbers than no numbers at all. And at the end, we end up saying, hey, careful, this number probably is too big, is too large. But on the same side, like we are just looking to the impacts through the Airbnb market. Like many other things happened, you know, so, and people are already like, oh my God, $300 million. So it's like, okay, at least, but we say, careful, this is probably because we are using in-plan multipliers, this is probably a large number for what we are studying here. On the other hand, what we are studying here is only a small portion of the overall impact that is generated. And
Okay.
especially in this area, I'm pretty sure that higher impact, and we'll never study that because the data is very difficult to gather, was on the secondary residences. Like the amount of people, like it's almost like 70% of the whole properties in this area. It's people that have their houses here in Florida, but they come from Washington, D.C., Chicago, New York to spend here some time. And in that year, they didn't come.
Okay, okay. Okay, thank you.
There is a question in the chat.
Again. Okay, thanks, Joao, for an interesting presentation and work. Related to the Westminster questions, my question is that can you share with us what is the mechanism to inform visitor about the results of the red tide test, how the potential visitors are informed?
Yeah, so so there are two things. First of all, from the county point of view and the municipalities, if there is the danger of a red tide, look, very at the US style, they close all the roads to that place. Everything is closed in several miles. So that's one of the things. The other, there are now several sites that indicate if there are presence of red tides or not in different places. And that will warn you if there is a red tide nearby. Now, this is still not a very, for example, last year, 2020, for example. 2020, there were only like 20 or 30 events that didn't last more than 3 days across the whole coast of Florida in the whole year. So that year was exceptionally low. Now, what we know is that it is happening more, and all the I don't know, firefighters, police, county authorities, they are organized to try to keep everyone safe. So actually, I would never say that this is an issue if you are thinking of visiting Florida. Just might happen, and you might be unlucky. But again, if you drive 30 miles, you can find another, or 20 miles, you can find another beach that doesn't have a red tide, where you can spend the whole day and have a fantastic time. But for people so the main problem was actually not these sites, because these sites were already working, or this type of information, was when it went on the national news and it was made like a scandal, and it was made like that the point where everyone said, look, everyone started canceling in that moment. in the week after, there was no one there, and that's when things got really bad.
Thank you.
I hope this answered your question.
Okay, thank you. Any other question or comment? No? Okay, so if there are no more questions, we can stop here. Thank you, Joao, again for your excellent work and presentation, and thank you also for the presentation of the Aveiro conference. And thank you, everybody, for joining this meeting. And okay, we can close here.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Much.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.